Welcome to the Miles to Zen podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Miles Halliday, and this is the last podcast episode of season 1. This is episode number 48, and this season of the Miles to Zen podcast has been really about one thing above all else, and that has been an unfolding. For an entire year, I didn't really have a plan, except that my plan was to follow my gut and my curiosity and post a podcast once a week. I had had enough structure in my former corporate life to swing far to the other side, one with an immense amount of creativity and very little structure. So I followed my intuition, and what a tremendous year it has been. I was told early on a number of things about podcasting, one of them being that unless I was famous, I needed to stick to one topic. Well, that advice was never going to work for me. I am the queen of curiosity, and one topic simply isn't enough to hold how I experience the world. So I trusted that. I let the podcast evolve the way life often does when we stop forcing it and allow it just to unfold. If you had told me before this podcast launched that I would be speaking with the man behind one of the most celebrated near-death experience stories of our time, I would deepen my understanding of Alzheimer's through a book and a conversation with a man who had a telepathic connection with his wife, explore death in a way that felt uplifting, loving, and even expansive. Just to name a few of the things that happened in the podcast, I would never have believed you. And yet, here we are. I've had the most interesting conversations with the most fascinating humans, each one opening a new doorway and another layer to how we can understand life, consciousness, healing, creativity, and connection. And one of the most humbling and meaningful parts of this season has been hearing from you. Early on in the podcast, a listener I hadn't seen in nearly 10 years shared how much she liked my conversations with Shannon Takas, the death doula, and with medium Jeanette Biro, and then shared the fact that she was facing a really frightening diagnosis. If I hadn't put out the podcast, and if I wasn't having those conversations already, I don't think she would have opened up the way she did. Another friend reached out after losing her mother, telling me how impactful the conversations that we had in the podcast were for her during that time. And a gem of a human in her 60s told me that my conversation with Monica Chignell changed her life. And that right there is everything. I always believed that if this podcast helped even one person, it would be worth it. Those moments alone made it 1000% worth it. Through sharing my own health journeys, I found myself revisiting knowledge I had learned years ago and processing it in a deeper, more embodied way by sharing it with you. And I hope that it can also help you some of those stories. There was laughter, a lot of it, because in challenging moments, we often have a choice. We can laugh or we can cry, and most of the time, we do both. Finding humor while tears are running down your face is a special kind of resilience, and it reminds us that even in difficulty, there can be silver linings. And funnily enough, I had to laugh at myself because in true following my gut fashion, I had set out in the fall to do a series focused on creativity, really about art, photography, writing, and what unfolded instead was something broader and deeper, conversations about building a life you actually want, stepping outside of your comfort zone, following curiosity, and saying yes to enthusiasm. And I think I made some friends nervous when they presented their good idea to me. And I ended up talking about it in some of the podcast episodes on creating the life that you want. But it was all perfect timing. And I felt it really fitting to close that series with Anne Mortifee, who may have had one of Canada's most interesting creative careers, spanning musicals, record deals, live theater, ballet, all guided by her inner voice. As Taylor Swift sings about it, it really did feel like following an invisible string. When I first imagined doing this podcast, I thought I would focus on decision making and decision making, especially in corporate environments. That was my socially acceptable way of talking about intuition. Because in traditional industries, even innovative ones like clean energy, the word intuition wasn't always welcomed. But talking about your gut and gut feeling was. And slowly, science has been catching up. So, from Dr. Tara Swartz's work to emerging neuroscience, we now understand how deeply connected our bodies are to decision making and how much processing happens outside of the brain. Even if you don't resonate with the consciousness side of intuition, science increasingly supports the wisdom of the body. And I've always relied on how something feels. Myers-Briggs confirmed that intuition is one of those traits that's never moved closer to the middle ground, whereas all the other indicators of theirs did. And this past year, I made a conscious choice to listen to it almost all of the time and see where it led. So, what did I learn from this year of weekly podcasting? I learned be ready to be ready. And I've talked about that in some of the podcasts. And in this case, preparation before I launched mattered more than I expected, especially when there was a fear of public humiliation lurking around the corner. And for someone who prides herself on jumping in, I was a little more methodical before I launched the podcast. And I created a runway of episodes. I learned some of the tech. I'm still learning. And then I dove in. And along the way, I just had to run with things. This doesn't mean I managed to structure my episodes much or my guests. I tend to go more with the flow. But at the beginning, before I launched, I basically spent time being ready to be ready. And number two, structure for me can get in the way when it comes to my episodes. So I found that looser conversations worked far better for me. Really, the feeling of having a coffee date went so much better and felt so much better than when I was dedicated to following a script and while following a script of questions. And you may have noticed in like a few of the early episodes, well, really one where I tried to follow a script and of questions, and it didn't flow as easily as the other ones. I also learned number three, that I love sharing people's stories. And it doesn't matter if you're famous or you're not, your own story is always powerful. And I loved listening to people's stories who were drawn to do certain things that may not make sense to anyone else. So, number three, your own story is always powerful. Number four, engagement shows up in unexpected ways. Some friends told me that they already felt like they were hanging out with me on a weekly basis. So they would end up calling me and reaching out way less, which I found rather hilarious. And number five, I learned that it was worth it for me right after episode 1. And number 6, I learned that I wasn't necessarily getting out of my comfort zone, which I thought previously, but my comfort zone was expanding and it continues to expand. Thank you so much to Monica Chugnell for introducing me to that concept of my comfort zone expanding, because mine just continues to expand, and especially over this year. And I find that really cool. And number 7, even if you are working in your expanded comfort zone, one thing my mom would tell me when I was a teenager and I was scared of doing something new, she would just say, just pretend as if, Shan, a version of fake it till you make it. And number 8, community matters. I am deeply grateful for this curious, expansive group of listeners who are open to broadening their own possibilities and perspectives. And I never could have got to episode 48 without you. So far, you have been listening from 36 different countries and 308 different cities. And for a girl who wanted to have a job in the Foreign Service when I finished university, just to have this reach is really awesome. And one thing I did notice through doing this podcast was that the synchronicities really are everywhere when you start to pay attention. So this season was filled with moments that were perfectly timed, guests that just appeared in the right order, conversations echoing themes I didn't even plan, preparation aligning exactly when needed. From working with a somatic healer just before interviewing Dr. Evan Alexander to back-to-back conversations with guests, all exploring intuition from different angles, it felt sometimes like the podcast had a life of its own. And one of my very favorite moments was from, in fact, my first guest of season 1, Sam Plavins. We're wrapping up and we were talking about the fact that I used to have a Rumi card deck on my desk at my job, and that my favorite quote from Rumi was, "The wound is where the light enters." Well, she looked rather surprised, and she reached out in front of her. Laying on the coffee table was a card. On one side of the card was a picture of her dad, and on the other side of the card was the quote, "The wound is where the light enters." This card was from her dad's funeral 2 years ago. And that morning, when she was shuffling through some papers, it fell out and she placed it on her coffee table, the exact spot where we were doing our interview. And that was just a ginormous wink from the universe that felt like I was on the right path. So I launched this podcast to explore something new, to share stories that offer tools and wisdom and joy, and to help us move from surviving to thriving and remain open to the possibility that there's more going on than meets the eye. And so as I close this season, I think it's kind of funny that I'm reading The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life by Boyd Vardy, a book about inner knowing and wisdom and this connection with nature. And that's precisely where I started the podcast, with from barns to broadcasting, and thinking about the impact that nature had on me as a kid growing up on a farm. So he writes about how awareness sharpens perception, just like photography taught me to see light differently, painting taught me to see color, writing is teaching me to notice language, And life continually reveals new layers when we pay attention. And so he asks, where else in your life is there a path that you're missing? And that question feels like a perfect bridge into season 2. Next season begins with one of my favorite books. We will be diving into lessons from The Alchemist, and then heading into interviews with some really fascinating people who are living their lives just like the shepherd did in The Alchemist, finding their personal treasure, finding their meaning, finding their purpose, and ordinary humans doing extraordinary things, guided by their intuition, by their courage, and their curiosity. I hope you'll continue to join me as we have these delicious coffee dates or meaningful walks alongside my guests and their stories. Thank you so much for subscribing, listening, following, sharing, and being part of this unfolding. I can't wait to see where it leads to next. Until then, check out some of the episodes you may have missed over the next few weeks, and I will see you back in January with season 2.